Well, there's no irony in this transition. We're here today to talk about toxic positivity a little bit. And for some folks,
No irony.
Disney itself would be toxic positivity.
Mm.
This is a kind of a newer concept, I think, that is coming into people's consciousness when they think about how they interact with other folks. And for our listeners, when Alyssa and I were planning out a series of topics and episodes for this podcast, Alyssa, you brought this idea forward, this idea that when a person is going through something, we should strive to encourage them to have a more positive outlook, right? That's what toxic positivity is. That's not always helpful, right? That our instinct is to help people move away from pain and worry and sadness and anxiety. But when we do that too quickly, we're actually doing harm. And so when you and I sat down and talked about a podcast for leaders to help them become better bosses, you made a connection between that and wanting to talk about toxic positivity. Where do you want to start?
I think that for me, it's a ground level foundation to how I operate as a coach and what I think our bosses out there that are in our audience are trying to do too, which is meet people where they are.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of times, that's not necessarily this grand, golden, positive place of where they are emotionally, mentally, you name it. And this construct of thinking that the only place in which we can define forward momentum or gains or growth is through the means of looking on the bright side, or here's the silver lining, or buck up, I've been there, blah 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 blah, and all the rah rah and the cheerleading and all this.
Mm-hmm.
There are a lot of people that are really great at that, and that's great, but it's not the only tool that we need to be using as leaders. We need to meet people where they are. And for some folks, that means being allowed to hold the space for themselves in a way that you might not think is positive, that you might not think could contribute to growth. But every person is different. And I can tell you that I live with a person who is forward momentum and growth is not the same as mine. And anytime I try to say, but look at this and do this and da, 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 it's like nails on a chalkboard. It's got the exact opposite effect. So there's real power in understanding that positivity is not the only course by which we can obtain a perspective that's needed, growth that's needed, forward focus, future focus. It's not the only path. And I think that that's what toxic positivity speaks to, is that we have constructed this thought pattern and then thereby making actions that say it's not okay to be negative, to complain, to not be totally 1,000% always on board. And, if you feel this way, you better do it in the quiet of your own home and don't let me see it.
Right. And that's the extreme edge of it. And there are leaders out there who show up that way, who will say, listen, you got some drama happening at home. You just better check that at the door and come into work. And I don't want to have that infiltrate what you're doing here. And when people are unable to do that, treat those folks as failures.
Yeah.
Or as incapable or incompetent. But I think what you alluded to earlier is what is more common, which is the well-intentioned leader who's not showing up at the edges of that extreme.
Sure.
But who is instead trying to engage in some reframing for folks. Like, we know that this is an important trait, quality, characteristic in leaders, to be able to help folks see things differently and to reframe things in ways that result in people buying in and wanting to move forward. Sometimes it's connecting people to mission. And, we talk a lot about storytelling as leaders and why we need to be better storytellers to connect people to purpose and to help people overcome the difficult things that show up from time to time in the workplace. And so reframing is really important. It's something that we have to work on as leaders. But when someone's going through something, if we automatically reach for reframing too quickly, we may miss an opportunity to sit in it with them, which actually strengthens our relationship and gives them the time and space they need to move through it in a healthier way. And so here's my question to you. What are the things that well-intentioned leaders say or do that come out as toxic positivity that may prevent people from having permission to recover on their own timeline?
Yeah. So I think what I want to point out is exactly how you just phrased it, is to anything that doesn't allow for the time and space for someone to be where they are. If we reframe too quickly. So for instance, to say, well, but I did that and this is what happened and listen, blah, 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 blah. Okay. So trying to speak from your own experience, while that's great and sometimes it works for people, and maybe in time that will be an okay thing to share to help someone move along. But understand too that you have to leave the time and the space. And that's what a coaching question does in this space, is to say, and how does it feel? Or what would be supportive for you in this moment? Truly listening and holding space and just shutting up.
Yeah.
We've talked about that as silence as a tool. It can be really uncomfortable to have someone be really down and negative, and maybe it feels like they're just complaining and they don't want to solve their own problems. And I know that our bosses out there are astute enough to know the difference between this is a person who just likes to complain, who likes to wallow, who's looking for the attention, all of that stuff, versus someone that just needs you to be able to hold the space for them.
Yes.
Hold the time. Listen.
My wife works in senior care and has spent a lot of years developing skills around a methodology called validation. And I'm not going to pretend to be able to adequately represent the whole breadth and scope of what that involves. But one of the things that I hear her talk about a lot and that I've seen her do is not worry about having the right answer with someone, but just acknowledging that they're experiencing an emotion. When someone is showing up and having a difficult time, being able to say, oh, I'm really sorry to hear that. That must feel awful. I'm sorry that you're going through that. And just acknowledging that emotion is present. And I think that this is a hard thing for a lot of leaders. I think this is, a lot of leaders, again, they care about their people so much, and it is their desire to be a fixer or to have an answer or to be supportive in the way of, I am moving you past this uncomfortableness because I care. Whereas sometimes the very best thing is for us to resist the urge to buck them up, and we see this happening online too. It's not just in person. We see online when somebody says they lost their job, people respond and say, at least you have your health. Or they say that a relationship ended and we say, well, you'll find someone. Or they say that they're not feeling well and we say, oh, it could be worse. And there's this constant momentum away from the discomfort. Instead of just saying, yeah, you're right, breakups are really hard.
Yeah. Because every time we offer up one of those things is another opportunity for that person to feel like what they're going through isn't valid.
Mm-hmm.
Their feelings about how significantly this is affecting them aren't real. And the terms of which you're available to them are conditions that are much smaller than what they thought they were.
Mm.
So it's just an opportunity, I think, for us to think about the space in which we hold people. It doesn't always feel positive to help. And we need to be okay with that.
I love the phrase you just used about how you are available to them. And I think if we want to ensure that some of our listeners aren't inadvertently engaging in toxic positivity, in some ways they need to reimagine how they are making themselves available to their personnel. Not just as a source of information, the answerer of questions, the giver of directions, the maker of the schedule. But, I care about the person inside the employee.
Mm-hmm.
And when I notice that something's not right, and sometimes it's the noticing that comes before the toxic positivity. If we've built some trust and some caring and there's a healthy relationship there, then we may be confident enough to go up to somebody and say, hey, are you okay? You just seem you're not like yourself today. Is everything all right? And if that person answers and shares something personal, sometimes then that's where the unforced error occurs, where someone, in an effort to express caring and be supportive, tries to push them past the unpleasant feeling. And we need to reimagine how we are making ourselves available to them by instead saying, well, first of all, I'm so sorry that you're going through that. And second of all, thank you for sharing that with me and trusting me enough to let me in a little bit with what's going on with you. How can I support you? And not worrying about having the answer.
That's right. Not the fixer of all the problems,
Yes.
Not the cheerleader of all of the sidelines that you have to be on. Just holding the space, being available.
And making sure that you're not doing the toxic positivity thing at home with your partner. Even with my kids, I've been a little more thoughtful about that lately. Because I'm a reframer too. I am an optimistic idealist. We may have talked about this before, which can be a little obnoxious. I'm constantly, for myself, that's how I handle stress. That's how I handle difficulty. It's almost always through the lens of it could be worse. Be grateful for what you have. It could be worse. And I know that I project that outward. And I know that with the people around me, I may be showing up in that way too quickly. And so this is not just a workplace thing. If you want to be a better human, we have to kind of notice that it's not our business to tell people when it's time to buck up. It's more our business to be supportive, to express our caring, and to be there to walk next to them on their own journey.
I could not have said it better, summed it up, and or put the point on that sentence any better. Thank you, Joe.
My pleasure. And thank you for bringing the topic to our podcast. I think it's a really interesting one. I have a feeling it's one we're going to revisit. And I would love to know what you think, listeners. I'd love for you to leave a comment under this episode on our podcast webpage, bossbetternowpodcast.com, or head over to the Boss Better Now Facebook page where you can leave comments, ask questions, suggest ideas for the show, and more. You can also email us, bossbetternow@gmail.com.